Liz received a BFA in Fiber from Maryland Institute College of Art and an MFA in Fiber and Material Studies from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, where they taught from 2014 to 2018 in Fiber and Material Studies, Sculpture, and Low Residency MFA program. From here, it sounds like they're off to an art-making road trip, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Liz Ensz was born in Minnesota to a resourceful family of penny savers, metal scrappers, and curators of cast-offs. With an interdisciplinary approach, their work presents a comparative study of the mass cultural investment of deposability and the human desire to imagine permanence through emblems, monuments, and commemoration. At the heart of their practice lies a determined material engagement, scavenger impulse, and the underlying textile logics of interconnection and entanglement. Their work has been supported by grants including the Jacques and Natasha Gelman Travel Fellowship, a City of Chicago DCASE Individual Artist Grant, and through residencies at the John Michael Kohler Arts Industry Program in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, the Francona Sculpture Park in Minnesota, Salem Arts Works Salem, New York, Hyde Park Arts Center, Chicago, Illinois, Blue Mountain Center, Blue Mountain Lake, New York, Oxbow School of Chicago Art in Saugatuck, the Center for Land Use Interpretation, Desert Research Station, Hickley, California, and Playa Summer Lake, Oregon. Their practice is currently based in Baltimore, Maryland, and Brooklyn, New York. Liz has done a phenomenal job working with us over the last few days. They worked tirelessly late in the evenings all weekend to get this show up. It looks beautiful. I'm sure you agree. They also did individual critiques with all our seniors, and that's really part of the prized, kind of what we really focus this program on. So thank you for taking the time, and seniors, I hope that you listened well and took notes. Liz is off from here to, I think they said New Mexico, and then to Joshua Tree, and then heading to New York City. Living the life of a young artist has made me envious, to say the least. So please help me welcome Liz. Hey, Ann Simpkins, retired professor of painting.
How's that pollen out there? Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks, Michael, for all the help setting up the exhibition. Thanks, seniors, for inviting me into your studios, and congrats all of the scholarship recipients. It's so exciting. I didn't remember 30 minutes. I remembered 45. No, I'm going to cut a couple things, so I'll try to be brief through the beginning of a couple of slides, but I'll try to get you to the exciting parts. I wanted to first show a couple slides of inspiration and research, and then work chronologically through a few recent bodies of work related to landscape in America. And I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of several bands of indigenous peoples when we're talking about landscape. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Cool. All right, so I'm just going to show a couple art historical examples for context. These are 5 paintings from a series by Thomas Cole called The Course of Empire, and they correspond with sort of like theories of the sublime and ways that landscape had been interpreted by the settlers of the North American continent, sort of the European context for what landscape meant. And in the course of this series of 5 paintings, you have this like Edenic, beautiful, untouched landscape, and then there's some kind of tumultuous, dynamic action that's happening. And then a lot of what influenced Thomas Cole's painting were some theoretical writings about the sublime. So, for example, Immanuel Kant in like the 1790s Critique of Judgment was writing some of his definitions of the sublime, including that it could be mathematical or dynamic or even moral. And in this series of paintings, Thomas Cole presents this idea of dynamic sublime, this sense of change over time, which is something I'm going to talk about in the other work that I show of mine. And in these paintings, the time is unfolding sort of on a human scale, and throughout the paintings you see like these elements of the landscape. Here's like a cliffside, and you see it in all of the paintings sort of referenced here. So it's happening in the same place. Anyway, this sort of like dynamism or sense of cataclysmic juncture was the point at which Immanuel Kant and then sort of Thomas Cole were working. That was during the Industrial Revolution and other revolutions on both sides of the Atlantic that were happening. So this painting that you see here is sort of like the high culture. You've got like lots of thriving people populating this space, and then this sort of war and stormy sky, the sculpture falling. And for previous Enlightenment philosophers, they had established that beauty was linked to form. And here, of course, you see like a classical figurative form. But the sublime was linked to formlessness. And so a sight of the absence of beauty, something dark, or something unknown or unknowable, which was especially poignant for during the Enlightenment era, where there was a growing idea that scientific study could lead to knowing everything. It was sort of the new religion. And then the final of these paintings is sort of a reset for the landscape. Let's see. And in my work, you'll see that I'm working with some of these same ideas. I find Edmund Burke's elemental components of the sublime, as he defined them at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, to be transferable to what I see as happening today, this sort of what I call contemporary sublime, with categories of like the technological sublime or industrial or post-industrial sublime, and the climate sublime. Welcome to the Anthropocene. So this is a term that's been in use since about 2002. Paul Crutzen suggested that the Earth had transitioned from this geological epoch called the Holocene, or just current era, to the Anthropocene, or the age of man, meaning that human activity is not only recorded in the Earth's geological record, but it's the primary force in shaping it. And since then, there's been other geologists who have published extensively on the concept of the Anthropocene, and in the last 10 years, we've seen many artists and academics and anthropologists embracing this term. Scientists debate the starting date of the Anthropocene. Some argue that agriculture would be readable as the first mark of man in the geological record. That's dating back about 11,000 years. Others think that the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century and the increase of fossil fuel usage and pollution would be the starting point, and some argue that the first atomic bomb tests would be like the strata that would define the beginning of the Anthropocene. This is just an example of some man-made stratification, some urban archaeology. We can't possibly bear witness to all the history in the way that Cole proposed with his dramatic moralistic series, but stratigraphy can give us an honest material narrative of history. So as we see here, that's just what happened. We also see this in like a natural way. If you see like a highway cut through a mountain or something, like all of the history of that mountain is sort of exposed for us to see. And each strata stripe tells a different story of a time. So again, I'm gonna try to get through some of this context and onto my work, but I'm going to show a couple paintings by Albert Bierstadt. He's one of the other famous landscape painters of the 1860s. a lot of his images are so iconic they might as well be like the imagery on money. But a lot of his paintings are sort of depicting the westward expansion of the United States after the Civil War and the Louisiana Purchase, and they promise this like Eden of plenty in the West. So here's an example of that. Bierstadt himself had studied painting in Europe and lived in the Alps, and many of his compositions include fantastic landforms that aren't in the Yosemite Valley. And so, for example, you can see some alpine mountains in the background here, amplifying their like level of sublimity and awesomeness, but ultimately shifting them away from a factual documentary. So I began to consider contemporary sublime landscape. The one that I saw every day in Chicago, from like viewing the sunset like down a narrow passage between the grid of buildings, or from the second story of the Home Depot parking garage. These are just some examples of quarters. Just thinking about the kind of imagery that's like surrounding us and maybe like goes unnoticed. That's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, and I've made lots of bodies of work. Maybe it's not totally visible one-to-one in this work, but it's one of the influences that I have. Thinking about like what we say our culture is about, or what our society is about, the imagery on our coins and flags, like state flags, tells a lot about that. But in terms of the Anthropocene, our material footprint will actually outlive the emblems that we design to signify our political and moral ideas and stand as our lasting cultural monument. So this is a very small series of bronze castings that I created sort of as portraits based on some of the mountains, both true and false, in Albert Bierstadt's paintings. These are about the size of like the last digit of my pinky. And this piece is a culmination of a lot of ideas that I just talked about, inspired by Albert Bierstadt's paintings of the American West that often included a sublime view of a mountain and a sunset. I merged one of Bierstadt's sunsets with an image of an explosion to make this printed image. And the mountain itself is formidable but lifeless, formally referencing the monumental Half Dome Mountain in Yosemite National Park. But on the other side, there's a whole different sculpture. So if I walk around the sculpture, I get this view. The piece is called First There Is a Mountain, and it's referencing this Zen proverb, first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is, relating to perspective. So from afar, you see the mountain. When you climb the mountain, it disappears, and then upon descent, the mountain reappears. And I was trying to imagine this phrase in relationship to like the contemporary movement of materials and matter. First there is a mountain, then there is a industrial process, mass production, mass consumption, mass disposal, and then there's a different mountain in the form of a landfill. A human-designed flow of matter is linear rather than cyclical, which all other natural processes are cyclical, matter cycling. And then this is the view if you look down into the mountain here. And I was at the time I was in Chicago and frequently visiting the Natural History Museum and studying these like fossil exhibits, and created a series of these proposed fossils that might be found as part of the Anthropocene. So this one includes like a tire tread and a tailpipe and a dipstick. And here you can see the strata of the side of it. Oh, I never hit play on my timer. Michael, you gotta help me. Help me stay on time. Okay. It's sort of my nightmare to take up too much time. In studying the ways that America is represented in imagery chosen by the state and for coins and emblems, I was also thinking about the way our culture will be remembered when we can't choose the images that represent us. The earth wears its memory on its sleeve, plain to see in its strata. These layered deposits and accumulations tell a story of billions of years, and the human story is just written on the minuscule top layer. The current geological era, the Anthropocene, reaches back 11,000 years to when humans started cultivating crops, controlling fire, raising livestock, and our visible traces have been exponential since the Industrial Revolution and atomic era. Let's see. We may have really short interactions with a lot of these materials, but they don't go away once they're out of our sight. Oh, so this piece was just responding to the architecture that was in the gallery. There was this literally crumbling brick wall. And a lot of times I'll recycle my art. I think it's really important to me to, it's sad when you finish a piece and you're like, well, now what do I do with it? And I still want to make art and I don't have storage space. So this is a piece that I just cut up and made into another piece when I was done. There it is. These inquiries into landscape and wondering about the longevity of our American cultural model brought me to consider our cultural remnants and how they might read to someone studying our society in the future. After all, a lot of what we know about ancient civilizations, we learn by looking at their trash. I spent a summer illustrating an archaeological dig and learned so much about what people throw away in ancient cultures. This image that you see represents a layer of strata that I designed, mashed up of ideas of our society that might define us for the future. It's a composite memory that's meant to be a sort of disintegrated image of Mount Rushmore, a field of wheat, purple mountains, majesty, a pile of rubble, gravel, a flag fragment, and an industrial landscape at night. And so from this image, I have a background in textiles, and I made a repeat pattern print, so you can see it sort of stretched out horizontally, repeating into what becomes like a stripe of strata. This is an 8-foot swatch of the print, and it sort of becomes this homogenized stripe. And then the piece is actually about 20 feet long, so that's the whole stripe of it. And a detail. When you look at it up close, it's the same method that I used to print this one. So it's a CMYK print process, and you can see the little dots that make it up. So the image, the closer you get, the image just falls apart. And that'll happen with a lot of the weavings, too, where there's like kind of an ideal viewing distance, and then you get too curious, and it goes away. So again, thinking about the sublime, the state of being unknown or inconspicuous or unimportant, like this formlessness I was still so interested in. This is, so a lot of the pieces in the show are digitally designed and hand-woven on a partial computerized loom called the TC2, or thread controller loom. And this was the first piece that I wove on that loom. You can basically operate individual threads and design in Photoshop, and it's great. I love it. And so like the first piece that I wove was something, if anyone's ever seen how tires are stored, sometimes they're stored like this, where they have their own like logic to how they can fit together, which I love, which also is sort of this meta textile. As a society that is increasingly less involved or interested in making things by hand, our engagement with matter is extremely narrow, momentary, and often multiply removed from its raw material form. Material extraction, material disposal are intentionally invisible to us. With the institution of mass production, from the t-shirt that you're wearing to the plastic-wrapped prepared foods that we buy, matter has just become things. And you'll see in my show, like, almost everything's made by hand. There's like a couple digital prints, but you'll see a lot of like technical finagling, and it's I don't know, something that I'm obsessed with, knowing how to. I think this happened during the last recession, like I was like, I gotta learn how to grow my own food, and I've got to learn how to make my own rope and shear sheep, and like I did all of these things, and like I think it's really interesting to know how to make things from raw materials and just know how materials behave. And it's been sort of a life project of mine just to like investigate materials. But the result of the obscuring of material origins is a detachment from like the haptic and material intelligence that I value, and a dependence on like large-scale production and a loss of a relationship with raw materials that people used to have. I think a lot about where things come from and where they go. So this is just a detail of that image. You can see the individual threads. Yeah, so this was from a series of textiles that I designed that pair this accumulation process that sort of happens with geological strata and different stacking logics. Weaving is a sedimentary process too. I have like dozens of giant cast metal works I'm not showing you today, but that's like a whole other body of work that I couldn't fit in my car and bring to you here. But so you get the beautiful textiles. I started translating some of the imagery from American state flags and coins into actual sculptural monuments in the style of text banners that you might see flowing across a flag or a coin. This ribbon with text is from the Idaho state flag. It translates to "it's endless" or "it goes on forever." And we imagine our lives and our culture as being permanent in a lot of ways. The reference to Latin, you'll see that there's plaques in the gallery that are also in Latin, and like it's sort of like an unspoken language, but I use it to reference these like ideal origins of democracy. And also it's just sometimes the actual language that's on coins and flags. I was imagining everyday disposable objects as symbolic monuments to our culture. This one's a cast iron shopping bag, cast in metal to emphasize the sort of permanence of the actual material of the shopping bag. And when I started printing the sheer textiles, like this is one of them, I started borrowing from the language of commemoration that both metal and textiles use, sort of like the monument, but also these symbols of sort of mourning. These plaques in some kind of finagled Latin say, "Remember the future, forget the past," and "Remember the past, forget the future." All right, let's have some fun. So in maybe like 10 years ago, I was in the desert with some friends in California, and we were staying in a trailer that was a residency for artists at the Bureau of Land Management, or CLUI, the Center for Land Use Interpretation. But it was surrounded by Bureau of Land Management land, and so that's public land. There's a lot of it in the American West, and what Americans do when there's public land is just dump their trash. And so a lot of the I was just taking walks and found all these tires, and you saw the weaving that I just made, and I spent like 3 or 4 days just like rolling the tires into one place to assemble. I think I found like 200 tires, and I wanted to like assemble like an actual wall out of them. This was sort of like an improvised road that was made on this land that led to like a larger dumping zone. So I decided to stack the tires to block that like dumping road, which I think not that long later somebody knocked it over, which is fine with me. I just borrowed the tires. And then I crawled up this mountain, and you could see it from far away. I was trying to see it, like I've been checking to see if it would be on Google Earth. And then a little while later, I did a month-long residency in Southern Oregon, specifically to see this landscape that would transform before my eyes, like that first mountain piece that I showed you, and like a couple of these works. I'm really interested in like how a landscape changes over time. And so in Southern Oregon, there's a seasonal lake, and I arrived in October and got to see like the dry summer switch to the rainy season, and see like literally it just felt like the place was different every time I blinked my eyes, and it was so beautiful. And yeah, everywhere I'd look there'd be like a storm and then a rainbow. And I thought I would like be there in my studio making stuff, but I was so distracted by how beautiful it was that I couldn't make anything, and just decided to let it go and look at all the rainbows. So this was what it looked like when I got there. This is an image of the lake bed, and like slowly over time it was starting to build up water, and truly like the light was so different and beautiful every day. It was, or every 5 minutes. All of these images are from the same place. And then there were storms. These are two like storms like meeting each other. It was kind of crazy. And then eventually it snowed. And it was really beautiful in Southern Oregon. This is a Google Maps view of it. And when I returned to a really, really brutal winter in Chicago in late November, I really missed the mountains, and I wanted to I was like in my pajamas in my room, like trying to look at it on Google Earth, and try to retrace some of the walks that I took. And so that's the map. This is the view on Google Earth. You can see these seasonal lakes. And the aerial view is sometimes referred to as the God's eye view, implying a perspective of authority, a position of power, but also one of morality. And it's a view that humans have only accessed in the past century with the innovation of flight. But it's from this internalized position of dominance that the Earth has been surveyed, surveilled, mapped, remapped, resculpted, rearranged, and although it's still undeniably vast, is now knowable in an unprecedented and unquantifiable, or quantifiable and controllable way. Conversely, the aerial view can drastically alter an understanding of a space and uncover an entire world of intentionally hidden activity that is absent from the pedestrian experience of a place. So I spent a lot of time just like moving around in Google Earth, trying to do sort of like a street view walk in some of these like more wild places. And I noticed that there were a lot of glitches in the imagery, and I became really obsessed with these virtual spaces. The glitches and inconsistencies in the two data sets were delightful and surprising, and also sublime. The aerial photographs have been taken by Google in the last 15 years, and the topographic data was collected by the U.S. Geological Surveys around the same time as Albert Bierstadt was making those paintings. And so this is the map that overlays over this place, which is, and then I started just like looking around in Google Earth and trying to find these like sites of interest, sites that would have like, again, some change over time. And so what I was seeking out these places that I could see a difference between when they were mapped and what they looked like today. And also, since I had been doing all this metal casting, and also this sort of side note, I grew up with a much older brother who was a metal scrapper, and so I spent like my whole childhood like in the truck like picking up metal with him like all night long in the alleys. And so like metal has like a really special place in my heart. And so like was looking at these like places of metal mining. This is a gold mine in Colorado. I'm also interested in metal because of its like the idea of value that's embedded in it. And so I'll sort of speed through some of these images because you can see them in person over here. But the aerial view that Google collected, the satellite imagery, is draped over the mountain form that used to be there. And so in a lot of ways, this has become this sort of the only way to know the mountain that was there. Because Google, I think they've probably done some updates, but at the point that I was navigating, and a lot of the spaces are still like this, but they're using this 19th century data to create the overlay of the image. So these images look ridiculous. They like the strata or the sort of layers of strip mining are draped over this like mountain peak, or this road is sort of hovering low below where it would be. And so I started to think about like how the maps, the topographic maps from the 19th century were like the only parts of this mountain that were left, besides that it had like been pulverized and like shipped all over the world, basically. So I reconstructed one of the mountains out of cardboard by hand, and screen printed an image basically of the aerial view to go over it. So this sculpture includes a sheer printed textile so you can see underneath to see the strata of the cardboard. You can see through in the darker areas much more easily. And while I was at the Kohler residency, it's like a bathtub factory in Wisconsin where you can cast iron. I took one of those sculptures and cast it in iron to make it like a permanent form, a way to remember that mountain as a monument. All right. So you'll see this piece here. This was another topography from a mountain that doesn't exist. This is one of the deepest copper strip mines. It's outside of Salt Lake City. But we can remember it this way. I'm just going to skip over a couple just because I'm being mindful of time. And there's two more pieces that I'll talk about, and then I'll take questions. So I'd been looking at more aerial views of sites of material extraction and thinking about different methods of display, and also thinking about like my values and like how I like I showed you that I recycled one of my sculptures into something else. Like I have like a really, like my relationship to permanence like isn't, like I don't need my things to be totally permanent. Like a lot of the work here, like I'm trying to preserve, but then there's other work that I'm like, I could melt that down. And for the previous sculpture, I had created this like whole topographic mountain, but I had an opportunity to show this print, and I wanted to do it as like a big sculptural installation. It's a print, so I made 6 of them. And I had made a whole frame for it to be a sculpture and couldn't bring it with me. So I decided to make it was going to be a giant sculpture draped on the floor, and I decided to make all of the sculpture out of things I knew I could count on finding on site. And because of how we get materials shipped all around the world on pallets with cardboard, I could count on having those materials at hand when I arrived in New York. And so I luckily had like a few days to make a sculpture. I had a staple gun and was just like stapling together this like mountain form on like 25 pallets, and draped this is about 50 feet long. I think it's like 6 of the prints. Draped this really big form. Just using those materials that I could just give back to wherever they came from when I was done. So here's an image of it installed. And again, this is one of the panels, but it's all sheer fabric, so you can see through it. Sometimes I would hide other things under there, and yeah. While I was there in West Haverstraw, New York, which is just north of New York City on the Hudson, it's an old industrial town, a lot of the industry left, or a lot of the mill industry left, and we were in one of the mill buildings installing the art. There were two major landmarks that I passed every day on my drive from my friend's house to the temporary gallery. One was a gravel factory that had like this really big, formidable mountain with a sheared face that sort of looked like Yosemite's Half Dome that I've referenced a couple times. And from the banks of the Hudson, the road that I drove on snaked around between this cliffside and a complex of multi-story pulverizing machinery that broke up all of this rock. From there, I'd drive along a road that was basically a crack between two mountains that used to be one. And I had this long glimpse of light through a bunch of little trees that were blocking a view of something. So I got curious and I wanted to know, like I could see on Google Earth what was behind the line of trees, so I went home one day and looked, and so here's where we were staying on the river. Here's the factory, or the gravel factory. I mean, they would ship from there. That we'd drive past, and then we'd do like a spiral, and then drive past this cut up mountain and see it through the trees. And I realized that after several days that I was driving underneath this conveyor belt, or underneath the road was a conveyor belt that was just moving the mountain into the piles by the river. And it was just sort of what I was making the art about already, how the site of origin of a material just can get distributed using pallets and cardboard, and how we send things all over the world. And yeah, there's this invisible network of fragments in motion that we're all entangled with. This is the last project I want to talk about, and it's one that's in the gallery also, and probably one that is a curious object in the gallery. A couple summers ago, I spent the whole summer experimenting with a really mundane and common material, HDPE, which is number 2 plastic. If you've ever looked at the bottom of a plastic container, you know there's 6 kinds of recyclable, or sometimes 7 kinds of recyclable plastic. Some of them are really hard to recycle, and some of them are really easy. Number 2 plastic, I think of it as a play plastic. It's sort of like a kid could probably recycle it. And I was thinking about this ubiquitous material and how it's going to outlive me. Here's some images of me collecting and cleaning and then processing. I basically cut it into Dorito-sized chips, and then as a foundry, a metal caster, I've done a lot of mold making for casting, and so I had to think really hard about how I would mold this material, because it's hot. It's not too hot. It's I was basically heating it in a panini press. So it's up to 300 degrees, but it needs to have a lot of pressure to become a form. And a lot of times I'll make a mold with rubber, but that wouldn't hold it, or plaster, but it couldn't stand the pressure, so I had to make it out of wood, which is not a common molding material. But luckily, I teach at a school that has a CNC mill, so I found a bunch of scrap cardboard, laminated it together with wood glue, and then made a set of 4 molds to make this form. I designed it in Rhino, which is a 3D modeling software. And basically made I was trying to make this fossil and make it out of plastic. Sort of we're kind of already doing that out in the world, but I was thinking of how I could sequester this material in a way that it wouldn't be out in the world or would add value to it and make people not want to throw it away. So here's the Rhino model. Originally I had like 2 parts of it, and one had like a flip phone in it, and then the other part you like listen to the ocean in the shell. But I ended up only having time to make the one side with the shell. But you can listen, you're welcome to listen to the ocean and the shells if you want. Anyway, so I spent the summer just like learning how to make this, and a lot of the pieces that I do, like it involves like a pretty involved process of like learning how to make something, which I guess is what I like. So it needs to be kind of hard. Here's the studio I set up. It's just like 2 panini presses. Here's the molds. I just used like vegetable oil as a mold release. And then I had 80 pounds of these like plastic containers that I had cut up. And I think this was a video. So this is the process. This is just me like putting the chunks of plastic on the panini press. That's it. And then you flip it, and then you shove it in a mold. And the melting point's low enough so there's no fumes or anything. Again, here's the molds, here's some of the shells. Here's one of the prints, final ones. And then just looking at my watch, I think I'm done. Thank you everyone so much.